My mother pushed a stack of legal documents across my grandmother's marble countertop. "Sign away your claim," she said, "or I will bury you in court until there's nothing left of you." She wore a tight little smile that had waited decades for this moment. I didn't argue. I signed every page. I picked up my bag, took one last look at the sun falling through the glass roof, and walked away from the home I loved most. She thought that signature was her crown. But here's what none of them knew. I had memorized every burden attached to that penthouse. She had never bothered to read a single line. And the very next morning, her own attorney was shouting so loudly my brother could hear it through a closed door. "My name is Clara Vance. I'm 38 years old, a preservation architect. The kind you call when an old building needs someone who sees its bones." 10 months earlier, my grandmother Harriet died peacefully in the bedroom she designed herself inside the Mercer Corset factory, penthouse, the old industrial relic she and I rebuilt together. At the funeral, my mother Miriam stood dry-eyed and straight-backed, her lips moving faintly through the eulogy. She wasn't praying. She was doing arithmetic. 2 weeks later, the family gathered in the office of Paula Keating, the estate attorney Harriet had hired years before. The will was short. The penthouse and all its contents went to me. The liquid estate, roughly $300,000, was divided between Miriam and my brother Caleb. There was also a personal letter. Paula read one line aloud. "The house goes to Clara, and she knows which piece matters." I remember thinking that was a strange sentence. I had no idea I would spend nearly a year turning it over like a key that fit no lock I'd yet found. Across the table, my mother's face went white, then terribly smooth. She smiled at Paula and said, "Mother always did love a project." Caleb stared at the carpet and said nothing. I would learn that was his position on everything to come. In the parking lot, Miriam hugged me, told me we'd all get through this together, and complimented my coat. 9 days later, a thick envelope arrived from a law firm I'd never heard of. My mother was challenging the will and accusing me of undue influence. Now, to understand my mother, you need to know what 63 years had trained her to expect. Miriam was Harriet's only daughter, raised in a world where a woman's life was a ladder you climbed by waiting. She wore the right dresses, chaired the hospital gala for 11 years, and kept a house so immaculate it looked uninhabited. She did everything that world demanded beautifully, and her reward was supposed to arrive on schedule: her mother's property, her mother's status, passed down by seniority. She never wanted to live in the penthouse. Exposed brick and concrete floors offended her. She called it the factory for years, right up until the appraisal came in at $5.5 million. Then, it became the family home. What Miriam wanted was the number, and more than the number, the order the number represented. Harriet dying was meant to be the moment the crown passed down the line. Instead, her mother had reached right over her head and handed everything to the granddaughter who showed up in work boots. I genuinely believe that in her mind, she wasn't stealing. She was correcting a clerical error in the universe. I fought back exactly as you'd expect a preservation architect to fight. 2 years before Harriet died, I had insisted on an independent capacity evaluation, which she passed while doing the Sunday crossword in pen. I had insisted she use her own attorney, whom I'd never met. I refused to be in the building the day she signed. There were records for all of it. I brought the full file to Paula's office, laid it out like a winning hand, and Paula looked at it and said, "This is excellent, and it changes very little for now. A will contest," she explained, "doesn't need to be strong to be devastating." The moment Miriam's petition hit the probate docket, the estate froze. The penthouse couldn't transfer to me. Meanwhile, the bills kept coming: property taxes, insurance, utilities, building charges. Roughly $14,000 a month, paid out of the estate's dwindling cash. Time was not neutral. Time was her weapon, and it was entirely legal. I sat in my truck outside Paula's office and felt the first deep illusion of my life crack open, the one where my mother loved me somewhere underneath it all. Then I called my brother because I needed one person on my side. He didn't pick up. Caleb is 35, sells software, and has twin 4-year-olds. He's not a bad man. What he did next was worse than villainy. It was arithmetic. My mother, who has never once missed the location of a pressure point, took him to lunch. "When the penthouse sells, "Honey, I'm taking care of you and the kids first." All Caleb had to do was stay neutral, decline to confirm that Harriet was sharp until the end. So, my calls went to voicemail. My texts came back a day late, short and careful. He didn't stab me. He just held her coat. At Christmas, I got one real message from him. "She says she just wants what's fair, Clara." I sat in my truck outside a job site and laughed in a way that scared me a little. Fair. My grandmother had used her last free act on earth to say thank you to the hands that kept her alive, and my family had a correction to file. Through the winter, my life became document requests, depositions, and scheduling calls. Paula estimated trial costs between $250,000 and $400,000, depending on how scorched my mother wanted the earth. The estate's cash, the only inheritance Miriam and Caleb actually had coming, was draining by $14,000 a month. My mother was burning her own bequest to spite mine. Meanwhile, I developed a ritual. At every deposition, I brought a thick manila envelope, sealed, and set it on the table beside my water. No one ever asked what was inside. That envelope will matter later, so remember it. In January, the depositions began. My mother arrived in pearls, kissed my cheek in front of the court reporter, and then spent 4 hours under oath describing me as a predator who isolated her mother. During a break, she came and stood next to me by the vending machines. She smelled of gardenias and certainty. She patted my sleeve and said, "You were the caretaker, Clara. Nothing more. Caretakers don't inherit. No cameras, no court reporter. Just for me." I gave her nothing back. My profession had taught me to stand still when scaffolding shakes. I held her gaze until she smiled and clicked away down the hall. I waited until I was alone in my truck before I let my hands tremble. That night, I lay awake seeing our whole history through her lens. Every pipe I'd sweated. Every dawn I'd spent balancing the hydronic loops while Harriet handed me coffee. In my mother's ledger, it was all recorded as service. Duties owed by the lower to the higher. And the terrible thing was that some part of me had always half believed it too. Why else had I spent 38 years earning my place in that family like a subscription that lapses the moment you stop paying? While the lawyers fought, someone still had to keep the penthouse alive. The court appointed a neutral administrator, a tired man named Mr. Okonkwo, who approved a maintenance schedule because buildings don't observe legal holds. Twice a month, I'd sign in at the front desk, where Frank, the evening concierge, would give me a quiet nod, and I'd make my rounds. I bled the hydronic loops before the deep cold, ran the freight elevator to listen to its cables, checked the glass house gaskets with a flashlight between my teeth the way Harriet taught me. Those mornings were the only hours that winter when I felt like myself. One February visit, my flashlight caught a hairline split in the south glazing sealant. Small, early, the kind of thing you fix in an afternoon or watch become a 5-figure problem by fall. I wrote it in the log, dated it, and stood there a long moment. Somebody would have to fix that by June. I wondered who my family imagined that somebody would be. In March, my mother petitioned to have my access restricted, claiming I might be removing items from the property. There was no evidence, but Mr. Okonkwo, buried and cautious, changed the locks. My visits were cut to once a month, supervised, daylight only. I stood in his office and kept my voice level while I explained what a custom hydronic system does when nobody walks the loops. He was sympathetic the way a drowning man is sympathetic. Everyone's hands were tied. That evening, Frank stopped me in the lobby. He looked left, looked right, and lowered his voice. "They come, they take pictures, they leave. Nobody touches the machines, Miss Vance. Nobody even looks at them." I thanked him and drove home with my toolbox riding shotgun like a dog that's been told the park is closed. Then, in April, the biggest door of my professional life swung open. My small studio, 4 employees and a truck, won the bid to restore the historic Royce Armory, a landmark every preservation architect in the region had been circling for a decade. It was the kind of commission that defines a career and demands everything you have, which is when Paula laid the real arithmetic on her conference table. We would probably win at trial. Harriet's file was a fortress. But probably wasn't the problem. The calendar was 2 years to trial, likely 3 with my mother stalling, and she was already promising an appeal. Litigation costs in the mid-six figures, the estate's cash exhausted, and the armory wouldn't wait. "You'll likely win the house," Paula said evenly, "in 3 years. And you'll have sold everything you built to be worthy of it." I drove home the long way along the river. That night, I stopped asking the question I'd been living inside for 9 months. How do I win? And I started asking a different one. What exactly was I still trying to prove? And to whom? Before I tell you what I chose, I have to tell you about the coldest night of that winter. 4 below zero. Wind off the water like a grudge. At 2 in the morning, my phone lit up with an automated alert from the glass house monitoring system. Nobody had ever thought to remove my number. An ice dam was forming on the south gutter. Meltwater backing toward the glazing channel. If left until morning, it meant water inside a landmarked conservatory, insurance adjusters, and 6-figure damage. I called the emergency line, woke a groggy Mr. Okonkwo, got authorization, and drove through empty streets to the factory. I spent 2 hours on that roof in a headlamp and harness, steaming the channel clear, my hands past feeling, my breath freezing on my collar. When it was done, I sat back against the parapet, looked at the skyline throwing its light on the frozen harbor, and started laughing alone at 2:40 in the morning, because I finally saw the shape of my own life from the outside. The woman they'd locked out, the woman suing me asleep across town dreaming of list prices, and me on the roof in January, unpaid, unthanked, keeping her prize alive for her. I had turned even this war into another way to be the caretaker. Up on that parapet, my grandmother's voice came back to me, a question she'd asked once in the glass house that I'd laughed off at the time. It didn't sound funny anymore. It sounded like a door unlocking. "I'll tell you that question soon. I promise." In May, the lawyers arranged a settlement conference. Bad coffee, a long table, my mother in a linen suit the color of a wedding. Before the talking started, I lifted a 3-inch binder out of my bag and set it on the table with a thud. I'd spent a month of nights building it. The house book, every system mapped and photographed. Maintenance schedules by week, month, season, valve numbers, boiler settings, the elevator service log back to its restoration, the preservation easement in full, with inspection standards translated from legalese into plain English, the fade assessment, the payment schedule, the directory of the 3 firms in the state qualified to touch landmarked glazing. Page 1 was a letter from me. "Whoever ends up owning this house, this is what it needs. This is what it costs. This is who to call. The building shouldn't suffer for our war." Paula thought I was handing the other side ammunition. Maybe. But I had decided that whatever happened, nobody would ever say the house failed because I kept secrets. My mother looked at the binder the way you'd look at a dead bird on your doorstep. Then, she extended one manicured finger and pushed it back across the table unopened. "It's a house, Clara, not a spaceship." Her attorney's eyes followed that binder all the way back to me, and he stared at it a beat longer than his client did. The conference collapsed inside an hour. My mother repeated her favorite threat on her way out, and I drove home with the housebook on the passenger seat, already knowing I'd be setting it on that counter again someday. I want to pause here because some of you know this exact feeling. If you've ever tried to hand someone the truth with both hands and watched them push it back across the table, you know precisely where I was standing. Stay with me, because everything that happens from here is why some doors, once they lock, never open again. If you've ever been the one who kept a family running while they called it nothing, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. In June, my monthly supervised visit fell on inventory day. I turned a corner into Harriet's bedroom and found my mother standing alone in the cedar closet, holding my grandmother's old gray cardigan against her chest. Nobody was watching but the coats. She heard me and didn't startle. When she spoke, her voice had no lacquer on it. "I did everything she asked," she said quietly. "The right dress, the right husband, the right smile for 50 years. She taught you the boiler. She managed me like a guest." For one breath, I saw it whole, a girl performing perfection for a mother who was already down at the factory in coveralls, learning valves, becoming free, and never once thinking to bring her daughter along. The same ladder that was crushing me had been crushing her for 60 years. She just decided the answer was to reach the top of it, instead of stepping off. I almost handed her everything right there out of pity, and I need you to know that about me. Almost. Then she felt me seeing her, and the lacquer poured back over her face like a lid closing. She hung the cardigan with 2 precise fingers. "This house owes me a life," she said, walking past me. "You're just the paperwork in the way." That same week, my brother Caleb called from a parking garage, voice low. He told me our mother had spent Tuesday afternoon walking a luxury realtor through the penthouse while the estate was frozen, while she owned exactly none of it. She had introduced herself as the next owner and discussed staging and comps. When the broker asked about the pending litigation, my mother waved a hand and said, "My daughter is just a formality at this point." Caleb sounded sick about it. To his credit, he'd called. To his debit, he ended the call the way he ended every call that year. "Don't tell her I told you. Things are hard enough, I promised." And I added it to the growing file of things my silence was subsidizing. The settlement demand arrived in late June. My mother would drop the contest if I renounced all claim to the penthouse and accepted a generous payment of $50,000 for my years of contributions. Paula read it aloud so I could hear how it sounded outside my own head, then told me the strategic truth. An offer like this meant their side had blinked. Discovery had gone badly for them. "If you want to fight, you are strongest right now," she said. And then Caleb called again, miserable. "Take the deal quickly, Clara, or she'll drag this out for years. She means it. She says she has nothing but time." There it was, her entire doctrine in a single sentence. She had nothing but time because she had built nothing, tended nothing, kept nothing alive. And I had no time at all, because I did. I told Paula I needed one night before we answered. She assumed I meant to weigh fees against equity. Fair assumption. Wrong. The number I actually needed wasn't in any spreadsheet. I needed to price out what my family's love had been costing me per year, and whether I could still afford it. I spread the whole truth across my kitchen table. Here is what the person who owned that penthouse was standing under in plain daylight. All of it in the housebook my mother had pushed away with one finger. The fade assessment, $312,000. First installment due within months. The preservation easement, a stewardship review already scheduled, and the trust does not negotiate standards. The south glazing split I'd logged in February would be on their list with a binding cure window at specialist prices. The carrying costs, $14,000 a month, bleeding cash. The insurance, conditioned on a named systems engineer of record, a status I held personally, about to lapse into non-renewal. My studio's service contract, signed by Harriet, terminating the day the deed changed hands. And you cannot close a sale on a landmarked property with an open assessment and an uncured easement violation without disclosing both. Luxury buyers do not pay list for someone else's homework. None of it was sabotage. It was just the house being what it was, a magnificent animal that eats knowledge and money on a schedule. Harriet knew. I knew. My mother had refused, twice in front of witnesses, to know. At 1 a.m, I called Jules Okonkwo, no relation to the administrator, my best friend and a structural engineer who had nearly met God with me during a scaffold collapse years before. She came over in pajama pants with a bottle of wine and listened the way engineers listen, without nodding, loading every beam of it. I gave her the whole case for fighting, the winnable trial, the fortress file, the principle of the thing, Harriet's wishes. 6 years of my hands. When I finally ran dry, she was quiet for a while. Then she asked the only question that has ever actually changed my life. "Say you win in 3 years. Walk me through the day after. Who exactly are you handing the trophy to?" "Your grandmother is dead, Clara. She's not waiting at the finish line. The only people watching you run are the ones charging you admission." She poured more wine. "You've been paying rent on their love your whole life. When does the lease expire?" I cried briefly over the stove. And it wasn't about the penthouse at all. It was 38 years of invoices coming due at once. We sat until 3, and somewhere in there, the decision stopped being a strategy question and became a bill I was simply done paying. If you're standing tonight where I stood, between something you love and what it costs to keep proving you deserve it. Pause right here and ask yourself Jules's question. When does the lease expire? Put your answer in the comments honestly. Somebody else in this audience needs to read it more than you need to keep it private. And subscribe if you want to hear how this ended, because my mother never saw it walking toward her. By sunrise, I had it whole. I texted Paula one short line. Accept the deal. She called before 8, certain I'd sent that text half asleep. I laid out my terms, and she went quiet in a new way as she realized none of them were tricks. We would transfer the penthouse and all its contents exactly as the law loves to say as is. Where is? Attached to the agreement formally would be the complete disclosure packet, the assessment, the easement, the trust standards, the insurance correspondence, the service contract with its termination clause. Every burden in writing, tendered and acknowledged. Second, an open written offer. My studio would provide a 90-day operational transition at cost, training whoever they hired, walking their people through every system. Third, I kept one item listed as personal effects of trade: my grandmother's brass drafting compass from her studio drawer, the one she'd owned since 1974. Fourth, I declined their $50,000. All of it. Paula pushed back hard on that one. I finally said the sentence I'd been circling all night. I don't need her goodwill. I need her signature. Paula was silent a moment. You know I'm obligated to remind you. You could win this. I know, I said. That's what makes it a choice. The other side responded within 48 hours, accepted all terms with visible haste, and added one request from my mother. The signing would take place at the penthouse itself. For the symbolism, her attorney wrote, almost apologetically. The night before the signing, Caleb called at 11:40, whispering from his garage. He'd seen the settlement papers on our mother's kitchen table and had done something nobody on that side had done in 10 months. He'd read a few pages. Clara, the maintenance stuff, the letter about the assessment, the trust thing. Is it true? I told him every line was true and had been true since November, sitting in the binder his mother had now pushed away twice. He was quiet for a long moment. She won't let her lawyer walk her through it. He tried. She told him she didn't pay him to read your paperwork. Then, maybe we should slow this down. I was kind to him. He's weak, and he's my brother. And both things are true at once. I gave him the only sentence I had. I offered her the truth twice. Caleb, there won't be a third time. It's all in writing. It always was. He whispered goodnight like a man leaving a hospital room. That same evening, I had been granted one final maintenance visit, supervised loosely by a paralegal who stayed on her phone by the elevator. I tuned that penthouse the way you'd groom a horse you've sold. I set every system to its safest holding state, labeled every valve, taped laminated quick start cards inside the mechanical closet doors. I ran the freight elevator one full trip and stood listening to the cables sing. Then, I carried the housebook to the kitchen island and left it open to page 1. Last, I went up to the glass house to say goodbye. That's where the old drafting bench sat, the one piece Harriet had kept from the factory's original design studio. I lifted the lid to check for damp, pure habit, and found an envelope taped inside, my name on it in her draftsman's hand, and beneath my name, when you decide. Not if, when. She had written it 2 years before she died, the same season as the will. I sat on the floor and read it by work light. She had seen the whole board in advance: her daughter's hunger, her granddaughter's guilt, the war, all of it. Your mother will fight you for the address, she wrote. If keeping it ever starts costing you your own life, let her have the address. The house was never the inheritance, my girl. The knowing is. Take my compass. Everything I ever drew, I drew you first. And at the bottom, the question she'd asked me once in that glass house while I laughed and steamed gutter ice. The one that had chased me down on a parapet in January. If this house ever becomes a cage, will you know which key you're holding? I slept that night, the way I hadn't slept in a year. The next morning I put on my good coat. My mother brought a smirk. I brought a pen. 10 a.m., July light pouring through the glass roof onto the kitchen island exactly the way I designed it to fall, when this was still a pencil line and a promise. My mother had moved the housebook to the far end of the counter to make room for the signing folders, the way you'd shift someone's mail off your new table. She wore pearls and the perfume of a woman accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award. Her attorney, Mr. Graham, arrived with a gray face and 2 associates. Paula stood at my shoulder. Caleb pressed himself into the window bay. Down in the lobby, Frank had held my hand for a moment as I passed and said nothing. Which said everything. Papers came out, red tabs saluting from the margins. My mother squared them on the stone and pushed the first set toward me with 2 fingers. Then she said it. The sentence she must have rehearsed in the car, sign it, or I'll bury you in court until there's nothing left. The smirk arrived on schedule. She glanced around the penthouse, already placing furniture in her mind. Paula, following our script, stated for everyone present that the conveyance was as is, that the attached disclosures were incorporated in full, and that my transition offer 90 days. My studio at cost remained open for 10 days after closing. She invited them formally to review the exhibits before execution. Graham drew breath. Miriam, I strongly advise we take the morning, and my mother cut him off without turning her head. We're done reading her paperwork. It's a house, not a spaceship. I watched Graham's jaw set as something in him formally resigned. Paula leaned close. Say the word, and we walk. We can still win at trial. The pen lay on the stone between us. Everyone always asks about this next minute. So here is the honest inventory of it. I felt the light, first my light. The angle I'd fought the glazing contractor over. Some part of me was already grieving it. Then my mother's words from the deposition hallway came back. Caretakers don't inherit. Except this time, they arrived without any pain. Like a bell with the clapper removed. She was right. Caretakers don't inherit. Caretakers build. And what your hands have built into you, no court on earth can probate. My grandmother had been telling me the same thing my whole adult life in her own words, and I'd nodded along and never once heard it. A building belongs not to the name on the title, but to the hands that tend it. I looked at Paula and shook my head slightly. Then I spoke to the room at my normal volume, which after 10 months had become its own kind of loud. One item before I sign. Listed under personal effects of trade, the brass compass in the studio drawer. It was Harriet's. It comes with me today. My mother actually laughed. A bright little spill of relief. Take your trinket. I took the pen and signed every tab, one after another. My signature was the same on the last page as the first. And I want to be truthful about what that felt like. It felt like sawing off my own hand to get out of a trap my family kept calling a table. And it felt like the first full breath I'd taken since I was a girl. When I finished, I squared the stack and slid it back across the stone. I laid my palm flat on the housebook one last time. Everything this house needs from you is in here. It needs it every week. It doesn't care whose name is on the deed. Then I picked up my bag and the compass and walked. Behind me, I heard a cork come off a bottle of Prosecco. She'd brought it cold with glasses. The toast followed me into the freight elevator, thin as cracking glass. The elevator I had rebuilt bolt by bolt sang to me the whole way down. In the lobby, Frank stood by the desk. He held his cap against his chest and said, "It was an honor watching you keep her alive, Miss Vance. The building, and the lady." I hugged him, broke about 4 of his rules, and let myself have 1 wet minute between the brass doors where nobody could see. Then I stepped out onto the sidewalk into the bright July noon and discovered I had nowhere I needed to be. No one waiting for me to fix anything, and no idea what to do with either fact. At 8:41 the next morning, my phone rang. Caleb. Whispering again, but a new kind of whispering, the kind you do when someone is screaming in the next room. Here is what happened. Graham, preparing to list the penthouse immediately, had finally sat down and done what post-closing diligence requires. He read the exhibits, all of them, for the first time apparently in full, because his client had been swatting them away since November. He read the fate assessment, $312,000, the trust's stewardship letter with the binding cure window, the insurance correspondence, and the non-renewal that followed my exit like a shadow. The service contract terminated by the very deed his client had toasted. And then, Caleb swears the walls moved. Harold Graham, 58 years old, dignified as a bank lobby, stood in my mother's kitchen and shouted, "You signed for it, as is." She attached the manual to the agreement. She offered you her own firm for 90 days at cost, and you have 9 days left to accept it. And you told me in front of my whole office that we were done reading her paperwork. Do you understand what you fought a year to win? She disclosed everything. My mother had finally taken her mother's throne, and the throne, as thrones do, had immediately presented its bill. I sat with my coffee while Caleb whispered the aftermath, and what I felt wasn't triumph exactly. It was quieter and much older. It was arithmetic balancing. She never called to apologize. The transition offer expired unaccepted. By late August, the penthouse was on the market at the full $5 million, with the disclosures attached as the law requires. The showings were reportedly lovely until the third page. The first price cut came in early October, the second a month later. The trust's review concluded, and the cure clock started at exactly the specialist prices I'd listed. They tried to sell the Steinway Grand separately and discovered that the only way a concert grand leaves a 12th floor penthouse is through a window bay by crane, with permits and a street closure. The rigging, quote, ate most of what the piano was worth. It's still up there, as far as I know. In November, my phone rang, and it was her. No hello. The heat is doing something strange in the east rooms. You need to come. Not an apology, a summons. The caretaker being called back to service. I looked out my window at the first snow falling and kept my voice the way I'd kept it all year. The numbers for 3 licensed contractors are on page 40 of the binder, Mom. I hope you kept it. Take care of yourself. I hung up. I did not block her number. She has not called since. That's not a wall. It's a boundary. And the difference is that a boundary has a gate I control. Caleb showed up at my studio in December with a box of pastries and his half of an apology. I held her coat, didn't I? I told him yes, he did. And that I'd have coffee with him once a month anyway. And we've kept that one coffee a month, both of us learning the new dimensions. The family narrative back in my mother's town hasn't changed. In that telling, I'm still the granddaughter who schemed her way into a will and then somehow mysteriously abandoned a helpless widow inside a $5.5 million penthouse. Some of the aunts believe it. I let them. Correcting it would cost me hours I now spend otherwise. Because, here's my after. A small sunny walk-up I chose myself, with my drafting table under the window, and a brass compass in a wooden box beside it. The Royce Armory site runs loud all day, and I run it. Hard hat and all. Sometimes, at the end of a pour, I stand in that gutted old landmark while the crew packs up, and I can feel it starting to come back alive under our hands. Nobody handed it to me. Nobody can call it back. My grandmother was right all along. A building belongs not to the name on the title, but to the hands that tend it. And the same is true of a family, of a life, of you. That's my story. One signature, one binder nobody would read, and a brass compass that was the real inheritance all along. If someone in your life treats your work like their birthright, maybe this is your sign to stop signing up for it. Share this with the one who keeps everything running, she'll know why. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one right here on Tranquil Drama Stories.